Hello everyone, my name is Zura. This is my one of the first videos on YouTube, and today's topic is closures, JavaScript closures. What are closures? Do we need them or not? Whether should we use them or not? I'm going to give you practical examples and explain how closures work, when do we have a case of the closure, and whether should we use it or not. I'm almost sure that at the end of the video you will finally understand what are closures, how they work, and you will discover that you have met closures a lot of times in your code and you didn't notice that they were closures. First of all, I want to give you a formal definition about closure. Closure is when a function is able to remember and access its lexical scope even when that function is executing outside its lexical scope. The author of this quotation is Kyle Simpson from the You Don't Know JS book, which is a really awesome book. I really recommend you to go and read this book, and you can find the link of this book in the description down below. Let's focus on the code and finally understand what closures are. Look at the following example. We have JavaScript normal function and a variable inside the function. And we have function bar inside another function. And we are executing bar inside outer function. So, in this case, bar is a nested function inside foo, and it has access to the scope of foo. So when we execute bar from the foo itself, it will print 2. Is this a case of this closure? Well, it's kind of, but in order to you to fully understand what the closure is, let me modify this code so that instead of executing bar, I'm going to return this bar function. And when I'm executing foo function, I'm going to save that returned bar function reference somewhere. So actually, this is an example from You Don't Know JS. So when I execute buzz function, now it works in exactly the similar way and the output is 2. But look at this. We are executing foo, and you may think that when the execution of foo is finished, the scope of the foo somehow should be disappeared. How is it possible that the function buzz, which is actually reference to the function bar, has still access to its inner variable, to foo function's inner variable A? And this is exactly the example of closure. So again, look at the definition. Closure is when function is able to remember and access its lexical scope even when that function is executing outside its lexical scope. In this case, we are executing bar function like this outside of its lexical scope. And it's working. Another example will be not to return a function, but give this function as a reference to another function. Like we have another function here which takes argument function, and here instead of returning our bar function, we are calling buzz function and giving this bar as an argument. So if you look at this code, you can easily understand that well, we need to execute our foo, of course. So when foo executed, it declares a variable, it declares a function bar, and then it executes function buzz, giving that bar. And inside buzz, we are just taking that argument function and executing it immediately. So the thing is that the bar function is actually executed when on this line. So if we look at this output, it's still 2. That's another example of closure. So the function is executed outside of its lexical scope. And the lexical scope for bar is a scope of itself, the scope of foo, and the global scope, all scopes on which the bar function has access. The most common and the most weird example is when we are using closures in the loops. And such kind of questions are really often asked on interviews. Like, consider the following example. We have for loop and we are iterating from 0 to 3, and we are just passing the callback function to set timeout function with interval 1000 milliseconds to print the E. So logically, if you are not familiar how closures work, you may think that this should print 0, 1, 2, 3. But the output actually is 4, 4, 4, 4. And the question comes, why? Of course. So the simple answer is that as far as the all callbacks are executed after the full for loop is finished, this means that E is 4 at the end of the for loop, and the callbacks are executed after 1000 millisecond, which is of course after the for loop ends, and that's why it prints 4, 4, 4, 4. But that's not enough. We need to understand what are each E inside the for loop. So I don't know So if you're familiar with scopes, you should know that var is a function scope, has a function scope, meaning that in this code we have only one E defined. So the following code is interpreted like if we remove this var from here and declare E here, meaning that we have only one I variable. Let me interpret the following example in order for you to easily understand. So I'm going to delete the loop, and instead I'm going to do a simulation of the for loop, like E equals 0, and then we have the conditional statement like E is less than 4, so I'm not going to write this, but E equals 0, and then I am executing this code. And then E increases. And then there's a conditional statement if E is less than 4. Again, I'm not going to write this, but then again we execute the code. And then E increases, and we'll execute this code. And again E increases, and we execute this code, and this happens 4 times. And finally E increases again, and there is a conditional statement which doesn't satisfy the criteria, and so the for loop finishes working. So this code will work in a similar way, will output the same result as the previous one. But I think that it's more clear to understand that when we are running this code, we are registering a callback, which will be executed after 1000 milliseconds. And the callback has access to an outer scope variable E, I. And then we are increasing I and registering another callback which has access to its outer scope variable I. And we're doing the same thing. And after 1000 milliseconds, all of these callbacks have access to the same outer scope variable I. We have only single I, and all of them has access to this I. And after all of this code, I equals 4. That's why all of the scripts write 4444. How should we solve this problem so that the loop writes 0, 1, 2, 3? So we need somehow to create different i's for each iteration. So we know that when we are declaring a variable using var, it has a function scope. In this case, we have the variable declared in the global scope, meaning that we have only one I again. But if we want to have different i's for each iteration, we need to define another scope for each I, like putting everything inside ify. Ify is immediately invoked function expressions. So this is a function expression which is invoked when it is declared. So it's a good practice that you give names to your ify functions, like even ify. So will this solve our problem? So we have encapsulated our setTimeout code inside a function which obviously creates a new scope, but will this solve our problem? No, because our I is still declared in the global scope and we have still only one I. So what we need to do is to declare a new I for each scope which we have already created. So we can create a new variable var j equals I, and inside setTimeout we replace I with j. This means that when this ify is executed, and it's executed immediately when it's declared, we create new variable in the ify scope and assign the current value of I to it. And then when the setTimeout callback is executed, it takes that j instead of I. This will obviously solve our problem, and we have 0, 1, 2, 3. And the simpler version of the following code is that instead of declaring a new variable here using var, we can actually pass I in the immediately invoked function and take it here as a j. And we can even call it I. So we are passing I, and this I is the I which is declared in the global scope, and this I is a I which is declared in the ify scope, and we are printing the I. And probably you know that. If you don't know, please go and read more about scopes or watch some videos. That when the engine finds I in its local scope, it uses that I. If it doesn't find a variable in its local scope, then it goes out. So in this case, if I call the parameter j and still use I inside my console log, this will print again 4444, because the searches I in the local scope couldn't find it, go to the global scope and found there and printed that. This is the end of the video. I hope you finally understand what are closures, how they work. Probably when you go back and check your code or someone else's JavaScript code, if you didn't find previously closures there. I hope that now you can figure out where are closures and how they work and why they work the way actually they work. Thanks for watching. I hope it was helpful for you. If you like the video, click on like and subscribe buttons to get more videos from me. And really appreciate it if you leave your comments and feedbacks and let me know what you think about my videos.